Welcome to the brand new anniversary series. There are just all too many animated movies to talk about, so I found a way to filter through them by covering them on their birthdays. Practically, when you combine every animated movie that's ever come out, that's basically a birthday every day. But some birthdays are better than others, be them 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, or 20 years. But the very first one we're going to begin with for this year is in fact one that came out a few days ago, as earlier in the week we had the anniversary for the Super Mario Bros. Movie. It's only been 1 year, so we can't go fully into a retrospective of how it's influenced the industry, but it is something I'd like to cover with future prompts later down the line. That being said, let's talk about the Mario movie now that time has clearly cooled our heads, and maybe we can look through this movie with a bit more of an objective lens. As since my initial review of the movie, we've had some high highs and low lows around the conversation with this movie. Now, the Mario movie is a project that I think is quite a notable milestone for the animation industry of this decade. The ideas and murmurs of a Mario movie had been going on for absolutely years and years before it eventually came out, with some crowd always speculating that Nintendo were going to make something eventually, surely. We all want it, clearly. The fact that it ended up then being rolled out alongside Illumination Studios was quite the controversial decision to go forwards with, but I think it's fair to say, pretty much across the board, this movie came out far better than initially expected. With the Illumination tagline and Nintendo having not necessarily the best track record in the past, this movie showed up with a whole chunk of disadvantages weighing it down. However, with it being the most iconic video game IP of all time and all sorts of directions that can be expanded because of the breadth of universe building that had already been established, there was a lot of potential for this movie, and I think that's pretty well reflected in the movie. Unexpected appearances appeared in the form of Form and Spike of all things and the extended Mario family, whilst at the same time the main plotline was pretty safe. And I think this is one of the biggest complaints that the movie really had. With so many Mario stories exposed to us in the past with all sorts of different games and RPGs, the idea that the story was literally just Mario beats Bowser, there you go, was something that came off as a little disappointing to a lot of fans, but I think that still works pretty great all the same. I personally had this gripe for the initial Sonic movie, so I think by the time that I got around to the Mario movie in 2023, a good 3 years later, I was a little bit more on board with the generic plotline. Sonic as well, actually, in the same week has just had its 4-year anniversary, so maybe I'll talk about that down the line, or I'll just hold out for Sonic 3. This week will also be cluttered with all sorts of trailers from CinemaCon, so I don't even know when this exact video is going to come out. Still, with a plotline as safe as it is, it manages to cover all of its bases in a way that's perfectly referential, a giant love letter to the Mario IP, as well as dodging some notable red flags in its story. While of course they didn't need to do too much too adventurously, the elements that I think they really needed to checkbox was really establishing a nice brotherly relationship between Mario and Luigi, which I think is fair to say that they did well. They needed to get some good fan service references to all sorts of other characters, which they do up front with the forms of Toad and Donkey Kong, and then on the smaller side, like Diddy Kong and Dixie Kong making appearances. However, with a gigantic roster as the Mario universe over the past 40-odd years, there were of course some casualties along the way. We got to see Illuma, we didn't see Rosalina. Apparently Daisy was visible in some concept arts, as well as Toadsworth, but they didn't make an appearance in the final movie. The kind of thing that made hardcore fans wish there was more, but I can understand why the movie ended up going for a more streamlined approach to really get from point A to point B without crashing and burning from the complications. One of the other major plot things they really needed to handle well, and I think they really succeeded, which I think goes a little bit undersaid, I think maybe it's like a unspoken rule, was their issue with the damsel in distress theme. Princess Peach as a character is one of the most early forms of the damsel in distress trope, as much as she existed in the 1980s, and King Kong's way older, and I'm sure there's all sorts of other stories from ages ago that showed just girl caged, save her kind of storylines. Still, Princess Peach as a character in the video games has often been incredibly flat, personality-less, and often is just restricted to the girl you get at the end of the game, which in maybe the 80s and 90s is a little bit more palatable as a storyline, but bringing it out to the 2020s is something that really would be grating for a modern audience. And so the way they handled it, I think, was absolutely brilliant. Both empowering her as a main character of her own, being able to stand on her own grounds and make decisions representative of the kingdom, fitting to her character, but also by relegating the damsel in distress role into Luigi, is a brilliant way to work out that formula in a way that works. I've seen fans say that they were disappointed with the plotline of Luigi because he got underused and became a damsel in distress in the cage, but to me, I think that's the perfect middle ground between those two challenges and allows for Luigi to be expanded in the second movie instead. I think it makes a lot more sense for the second Mario to be prevalent in the second Mario movie instead, whether that is Luigi's Mansion or a Mario and Luigi-esque movie. For me, Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga is my favorite aesthetic for the Mario universe, and the fact that we now establish Mario and Luigi live in the Mushroom Kingdom together by the end of the first movie means the second movie could easily go in that direction. Mwah, it's all you need. Again, this is why it works so well for the first movie to be so safe and simple in order to expand it into more interesting directions come the second movie. Now we can see Rosalina and Daisy and Luigi and Toadsworth, you know? That being said, as much as they have mastered some of the more basic Mario tropes, there are some Illumination tropes that did seep through with this movie as well. This was the other major disadvantage that a lot of fans were a little bit cautious of leading up to this movie, and there are some Illumination leaks, but I kind of think it's not as bad as it could have been. Naturally, there is just an Illumination dog in one of the scenes. I didn't really think this was necessary, but it's Illumination doing their thing. The general population like dogs, make them interact with dogs. It doesn't have to be Poochie. This, I think, was palatable on its own right, but another thing that did begin to show up and wasn't as bad as it could have been was the soundtrack. Illumination love to just cram in their pop culture bits for the sake of getting the crowd going, and the soundtrack to this movie does have some pop culture 80s beats. Now, I personally, I've seen a lot of movies, I've dealt with a lot of pop culture crap in terrible movies, I've got a bit more of a faintly more tough skin against this kind of thing. I didn't think it was too bad. It didn't bloat the entire movie the whole way through, and there was a vague connection to the source material with these music choices. Kind of. The choices of pop culture songs they included were at least vaguely attached to the 1980s era, stitching over the idea that this movie is attached to its 1980s source material game. That being said, Luigi also has a phone, so the timelines are not exactly clear, but it is there. At the same time, you could argue that this is just the same generic decade of normal nostalgia bait from all the other movies. Since Guardians of the Galaxy, every movie references 80s music, and this one's just doing the same. It's an Illumination trope to go for the most popular thing. It vaguely works. It's fine. I know a particular high point of contention is the inclusion of pop culture music replacing some of the initial score from the Mario soundtrack, but the fact that it can be restored at all makes me think maybe it's not too bad. When Donkey Kong is steaming around in the Donkey Kong lands, they decide to go with I'm Holding Out for a Hero, I think? But you can still find the Brian Tyler initial score that goes underneath it, so just take that as canon. It's a lot better than some other movies that just outright deleted or never created those initial scores. So really, with those two giant weights holding down this movie with disadvantages, they ended up being a lot more lightweight and passable than initially expected. Thank you for making it halfway through this video. If you're enjoying this series so far, do check below for whether you are subscribed, and also let us know of other movies you'd like us to talk about. I think I've got plenty of notes for potential anniversary dates for later on in this year, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what kind of things you'd really like me to cover. You know, it's the Shrek 2 20th anniversary this year. Similarly, who do you think will be meme-ifiedly cast into the Mario 2 movie? Anyway, this was just a brief break. Let's get back to the rest of the video. So beyond getting their checklist and not being as bad as they could have been, there were a lot of really surprising highlights from this movie. Things that weren't exactly expected, but turned out better than expected. For a start, Charles Martinet's cameo appearances as other members of Mario's family is just very sweet, and the fact that his final line is "That's my boys," as potentially his final line ever in the Mario universe, is just so sweet and wholesome. Although I also expect he'll appear in the sequel that's been confirmed. Whilst I found that there was a surprisingly good duo between Mario and Donkey Kong in this movie. As much as Mario is voiced by Chris Pratt and Donkey Kong is made by Seth Rogen, the idea of them being bickering kind of teenage vibes, I thought opened up to a lot of great comedy. And the fact that they're potentially getting a Kong spin-off really doesn't seem so surprising anymore. Chris Pratt's more muted but Brooklyn accented voice kind of worked for the Mario character, that it did kind of fade away into the role, which is nice. And Seth Rogen somehow fits as Donkey Kong, but the real star of the show has to, of course, be Jack Black as Bowser. I don't even need to ramble to you too much about how great this casting turned out. To really lean into Bowser as a genuine comedic character rather than a super serious one, I think is really Mario at its best in all sorts of games. I personally find Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door as my favorite Mario story, as much as it way spirals out of line with a demon by the end of the game. But in that, Bowser is a comedic character, still conflicting with Mario, but he's fun, and has all sorts of quips with Kamek, which appears in this movie too. Toad as Keegan-Michael Key is a little bit strange to me, but it's fine. And Anya Taylor-Joy does great as Princess Peach. Really, they're all pretty good, passable, or weren't as bad as they could have been. The real question is, now that Mario 2 has been confirmed, what lineup of characters are we going to get for the next roster collection? Oh my god, I need to make a tier list of character options for Mario 2. You know what? I'm writing that down right now. Look forward to that before the end of the month, I'm sure. Unless this video flops, in which case I'm never doing Mario again. Video games just aren't my channel's thing. At the same time, one of the other lowest points on the cast front, or maybe the character front and the scripting, was Cranky Kong. They, as a character, or as their voice performance, just wasn't as enjoyed as the rest of it, but considering Cranky Kong is kind of a secondary character, and even though they were kind of labeled as a king in the actual movie, I can see them not being prevalent at all in the second movie. It doesn't ruin the entire experience. Where this movie really excels in all of the love letter references to all sorts of Mario iconography. In the Kong lands, we see all sorts of Mario Kart references, you got Rainbow Road, or even the more subtle things like the breakage of the wall down in the sewers in Brooklyn being an actual sprite from the 8-bit Mario's head. I'm always a big fan of the Pikmin glass sculpture on the side. Honestly, it's even to the point I wonder if there's even references left to Mario iconography for the sequel. They've already covered all sorts of Mario Kart and all sorts of other Nintendo IPs. What's left? I guess at some point we'll see some Mario Party dice going on. Yeah, I guess the Mario universe is so vast they can't just keep going with things. But it would also be kind of a bummer if the Mario Kart vibe only gets lost to the first movie and not all the others. And even in the soundtrack, there's so many references to all sorts of other iconic Mario songs that I even just adore the score, despite it being a not very movie score style. It's just references the whole way through. It's a very strange sound for a movie, but I just adore it. I've always been a nostalgic fellow, and apparently that's even to a detriment at this point. And the style of humor that this movie chooses to go with surprisingly works, coming from Mario of all things. Now, this movie came out at a very interesting time for the industry of all movies, really, because the video game medium is starting to be well adapted into the big screens and the little ones. Really, I think this era started with the initial Sonic movie being able to work out hybrid live action well, but this was a fully animated thing, and it did very, very well, alongside its other relevant video game movies like The Last of Us and FNAF, or Detective Pikachu as well. But whilst all those other examples do use all sorts of live action to represent themselves, seeing it done well in animation could very well lead to its own separate era going forwards, even if they're all just Nintendo productions anyway. It's too early to say since it's only been 1 year since the Mario movie, but all sorts of other things we'll be covering in this anniversary series will really be able to talk about the impact the industry had. Perhaps some of the notes that future video game prompts could take on is the fact that they should really heavily involve some of the gaming creators. With that being the case with Neil Druckmann for the Last of Us adaptation with Pedro Pascal, and also being the case with Shigeru Miyamoto over in Mario World. Keeping it high on all sorts of references is always fun for some fan service. The simplistic plot is pretty good. It worked for the Sonic movie too for the first initial movie. Focus on the sequels to really expand into some interesting directions, and really, I wonder what clones of this kind of formula we'll see coming forwards. They may be simple, but if they stick the landing, I say they're welcome to stay. And as for Illumination, this movie really helped give them a heel turn in their representation, as the zeitgeist of conversation around Illumination generally considered them the butt of the jokes. Yes, they made unbelievable amounts of profit, but they also made pretty bad, terrible toddler movie content. Minions bad, Sing bad, Hop also bad. However, in 2022, the Minions 2 movie was pretty good. I'd even go on to say it was great. The slapstick really worked with what it wanted to do. And then 1 year later, Mario movie. Absolutely great. Simple, but such a crowd pleaser, being one of the most profitable movies of the entire year. It's a real turnaround for the conversation around Illumination. And even Migration later down the line, it did decently. Supposedly, I still haven't seen it. So really, this movie overall was a massive success. It came in with all sorts of disadvantages, but I think it dodged them well, managed to handle what it did have, and really made an emblematic movie that will undoubtedly shape the future of animation in some form. But what exactly that form of the future will be, we'll just have to wait a little longer, perhaps for a future anniversary. And that was the Mario movie retrospective 1 year on. Now, if you don't mind me, I'm going to start ruminating a tier list for the Mario 2 cast, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for making it to the end of this video of just yapping about one movie for 15 minutes. But for now, I shall see you in a little bit.